Welcome to all. Now we are living in a new world where everything takes place through Zoom, and we stopped seeing each other physically, but that's our new reality. This is ECPS's 16th panel, European Center for Populism Studies, 16th panel of the MGP. What is MGP? MGP is the Mapping Global Populism. But before we really start to listen to our participants, let me give an idea on what is really ECPS for the newcomers, for those who have never been in one of the 16 panels. This is an independent non-profit organization based in Brussels, devoted to the research and analysis of challenges posed to the entire planet, really entire planet, by ever-increasing populism. None of us can ignore today the retreat of liberal democracy and the parallel rise of authoritarianism as well as totalitarianism. Post-World War order looks today definitely in danger of war, chaos, and instability. So ECPS, in order to properly address these challenges, aims to supply evidence-based research and analysis and the various aspects of rising populism, which feeds directly into the authoritarianism and totalitarianism, and vice versa, So today we will be turning our spotlights to a very difficult sub-region, the Southern Caucasus. With the contribution of 6 experts, I would like to say to make 2 remarks about the experts. Thank God we have Jody. Otherwise, it would have been an all male panel. Thank you, Jody, for being with us. But believe me, it's not for not trying. And we tried our best to have a panel that had 50-50 at least, but we didn't succeed. And it's also related to our response from Azerbaijan. There are no Azeris here, and as speakers, and then that's my second point. It was more than difficult. It was impossible to have, independent Azeri experts. Even among those living abroad, forget about those who are living in Azerbaijan. And that gives a foretaste of what we will be talking about today, frankly. And no, we got no. I mean, our experts who will be talking about Azerbaijan are not Azeris. So before we kick start, let me ask our intern Anastasia Stamoglu to present our speakers, and then we will hit the floor with Tom Doval, who is in hurry, and we will listen to him first. And then we continue with Georgia. Anastasia, tell us about our panelists, please. Thank you.
Thank you. So first of all, and with all your permission, this panel will be recorded and broadcast on YouTube. So welcome to the 16th session of Mapping Global Populism panel series organized by the ECPS. I'm Anastasia Stamoglu. I have recently finished my postgraduate studies in political science, and as already stated, I am an intern at the ECPS. The ECPS curates this panel series aimed at dissecting the diverse manifestations of populism across the world, following the successful conclusion of our 8th-session Mapping European Populism panels. We have embarked on a journey to explore populism beyond the confines of Europe, by expanding our panel series to encompass a global perspective, aptly titled Mapping Global Populism, or MGP. Our objective is to construct a comprehensive understanding of populism worldwide, featuring monthly sessions. So today we will have our 16th session of MGP. This session will examine the challenging dynamics of democracy, authoritarianism, and populism in Caucasus, so Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. As a testament to our commitment to knowledge dissemination, we are going to write a panel report and share the video recording of this panel on our website and YouTube channel. These resources serve as invaluable references for scholars, policymakers, and a wide audience concerned about the contemporary challenges to global democracy posed by populist and authoritarian politics. In the ongoing journey of our panel series, we extend our gratitude to all the scholars and experts who contribute their extensive insights. With this, we introduce our esteemed moderator and distinguished panelists for today's intriguing discussion. So today our panel is going to be moderated by Dr. Cengiz Aktar, who is an adjunct professor of political science at the University of Athens and an ECPS advisory board member. He's a former director at the United Nations specializing in asylum policies. He is known to be one of the leading advocates of Turkey's integration into the EU. He was the chair of European studies at Bahçeşehir University, Istanbul. So in 1999, Professor Aktar initiated a civil initiative for Istanbul's candidacy for the title of European Capital of Culture. Istanbul successfully held the title in 2010. He also headed the initiative called European Movement 2002, which pressured lawmakers to speed up political reforms necessary to begin the negotiation phase with the EU. In December 2008, he developed the idea of an online apology campaign addressed to Armenians and supported by a number of Turkish intellectuals, as well as over 32,000 Turkish citizens. In addition to EU integration policies, Professor Aktar's research focuses on the politics of memory regarding ethnic and religious minorities, the history of political centralism, and international refugee law. Today, Dr. Jody LaPorte will be one of the speakers, presenting on the topic Hegemonic Authoritarianism in Azerbaijan. Dr. LaPorte is the Gontikas Fellow in Politics and International Relations at Lincoln College, University of Oxford. Previously, she served as a departmental lecturer in politics and public policy at the Blavatnik School of Government. Her research focuses on the political and policymaking dynamics in non-democratic regimes, particularly in post-Soviet Eurasia. Dr. LaPorte holds a BA in Russian and East European Studies from Yale University and an MA and PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. Before joining the Blavatnik School, she taught as a departmental lecturer in comparative government in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Oxford. Mr. Thomas de Waal will be our first speaker, discussing autocracy in Azerbaijan and its regional implications.
It's not. Don't get in this kind of things. It's my job to just give me. Don't get in this kind of things. Thank you.
Yeah, not a problem. So Mr. de Waal is a senior fellow with Carnegie Europe, specializing in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus region. He's the author of numerous publications, most recently The End of the Near Abroad. The second edition of his book, The Caucasus, An Introduction, was published in 2018. He's also the author of Great Catastrophe, Armenians and Turks in the Shadow of Genocide, which was published in 2015, and of the authoritative book on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, Black Garden, Armenia and Azerbaijan Through Peace and War, published in 2013. From 2010 to 2015, de Waal worked for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. Before that, he worked extensively as a journalist, both in print and for BBC Radio. From 1993 to 1997, he worked in Moscow for the Moscow Times, the Times of London, and The Economist, specializing in Russian politics and the situation in Chechnya. He co-authored the book Chechnya, Calamity in the Caucasus in 1997, for which the authors, which was him and Carlotta Gall, were awarded the James Cameron Prize for Distinguished Reporting. In continuation, our next speaker is Dr. Nerses Kopalyan, who is an associate professor in residence of political science at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. His fields of specialization include international security, geopolitics, politics, paradigm building, and philosophy of science. He is the author of World Political Systems After Polarity, the co-author of Sex, Power, and Politics, co-author of Latinos in Nevada, a political, social, and economic profile, and the upcoming Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh War. His current research and academic publication concentrate on geopolitical and great power relations within Eurasia, with specific emphasis on democratic breakthroughs within authoritarian orbit and the confluence of security and democratic consolidation. Dr. Kopalyan has authored several policy papers for the government of Armenia and serves as voluntary advisor to numerous state introductions. And he is also a regular contributor to the EVN report. Moving on, Professor Ashot S. Aleksanyan will be our fourth speaker, and he is the head of the Chair of Political Science of Faculty of International Relations, as well as lecturer of the Center of European Studies of Yerevan State University. His main interests are civil society, social partnership, human political rights and freedoms. He has been a DAID visiting scientist in the Institute of Political Science of Leibniz University of Hanover from 2002 to 2009, a DAID visiting scientist of the Geschwister-Scholl Institute of Political Science of Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, and the Institute for East European Studies of Free University of Berlin, as well as the EU Erasmus Mundus Alrakis project, visiting scientist at the Faculty of Social Sciences of the Katholische Universität Leuven. Since 2016, he is an international fellow of the Institute of Political Science at the Institute of Political Science of the Friedrich Schiller University, Jena. So the panel's fifth speaker is Dr. David Abrazidze, who will make a presentation on from the technocratic facade to right-wing reality, the evolution of populism in Georgia. And Dr. Abrazidze is a professor of political science at Ilia State University. He earned his PhD from Hamburg University in Germany and was a Fulbright scholar at Duke University in North Carolina, USA. Over the years, he has worked with public agencies and international NGOs operating in Georgia. His expertise includes higher education management and reform, with a research focus on political transformation, democratization, and Europeanization. Our last speaker is Dr. David Matsaveridze, who will talk on the rotating populist discourses of the post-Soviet Georgia. And Dr. Matsaveridze is an associate professor in the Department of International Relations at the Faculty of Social and Political Sciences at Ivan Zavachishvili Tbilisi State University. He earned his PhD in political science from Ivan Zavachishvili Tbilisi State University in 2015 and holds an MA in nationalism and ethnicity studies from Central European University. Between 2015 and 2017, Dr. Matsaveridze completed professional development programs in regional and international security at the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany. As a reminder, we will have a Q&A session after the completion of the presentations. Our respected participants can write these questions in the chat box or by raising their virtual hand and pose their questions in person. So now I turn it over again to Professor Cengiz Aktar, who will provide the overview of the panel subject matter and administer the panel.
Thank you. Let's kickstart now. As I mentioned earlier, we will go to Georgia, but before Georgia, I would like to give the floor to Tom de Waal, who has to leave us, and Tom will examine the regional implications of the Azeri autocracy, and because Azeri autocracy is something which exceeds the limit of Azerbaijan, as you all know. And then we will also take a few questions before we release Tom. Tom, you have the floor.
So thank you very much, Cengiz, and also Bülent and all the organizers. So I start with a thank you, also an apology that I have a very busy schedule today, also much going on in Georgia, and have to leave you. And I also join the regret that you, in some senses, are listening to me and not an Azerbaijani panelist, which would be ideal. But in the sense, the fact that the difficulties you had in finding an Azerbaijani panelist are also an illustration of some of the many of the problems with Azerbaijan today. So I'm going to talk a bit about Azerbaijan, but also the broader South Caucasus, because I study and work in all three countries in the region, and obviously we're facing a big crisis in Georgia, which you will hear about. But I would argue that in when people are saying that Georgia is looking to Russia as a model, I think Georgia is actually more looking to Azerbaijan as a state model of a non-aligned country that is not that is not close or a part of any big multilateral regional organization, which uses the language of sovereignty to defend the interests of the ruling party, in which the ruling party's business and political interests are fused. And that is, I think, a description of the ambitions of Georgian Dream, the ruling party in Georgia, and also of the situation in Azerbaijan. Now, clearly, Georgia is not Azerbaijan. Georgia is a more open society with a functioning opposition, and non-governmental organizations, and also still a heavy presence of the EU. But I think that is the ambition of the ruling party in Georgia. So let me also start with 2 points of context. One is obviously all the decisions being made in the South Caucasus are being made in the light of the war in Ukraine. All the politicians are basing their actions on watching how Russia's war in Ukraine proceeds. If Russia does better, they take one set of decisions. As Ukraine does better, they take another set of decisions. This is the important context that we are looking at. Excuse me if you see some background noise of kids. I hope that does not distract you. So this is the situation, but different leaders, I think, are drawing different conclusions from this. On the Armenian side, they're drawing the conclusion it was a mistake to have Russia as your monopoly security provider. This was a big mistake for them. They're trying to diversify their interests and build stronger ties with the West. In the case of Azerbaijan, I would argue that they are trying to kind of strengthen their own bastion of sovereignty. And in the case of Georgia, they've decided that the Georgian regime, they've decided that actually it's better to be cozier towards Russia, to have an appeasement policy towards Russia. This is the context. But there's a longer context, which predates the war in Ukraine, and I'm sure I probably won't be the first person to talk about this, but I'm a big advocate of the book by Stephen Holmes and Ivan Krastev called The Light That Failed, about East European populism, which is from a few years ago, and looks in particular at the phenomenon of Viktor Orban, of providing a kind of alternative message, an alternative European civilizational, illiberal message, in which the central, in saying that imitation of West is a failure. It's an act of self-humiliation. We must look to our own history, our own sovereignty, stop imitating the West. The age of imitation of liberalism is over. We can build a new sovereigntist, illiberal type of regime. Now, Orban was the first person to do that, arguably in Central Eastern Europe. And he's obviously been very successful, and indeed, as you will have noticed in the presidential debate in September in the United States, the only foreign leader that Donald Trump mentioned by name was Viktor Orban, the leader of a country of just 10 million people. And where was Orban this week? Who was the first leader to arrive in Tbilisi to congratulate the government in person? Viktor Orban, who has a very close relationship with the Georgian Dream Party. He also, and this brings me to the topic of Azerbaijan, has a good relationship with Azerbaijan. He uses also a Eurasianist language about how Europe is more than just Europe, is also Eurasia. So this is also the context in which the West is seen to be weaker, liberalism is seen to be in decline, and there's an alternative illiberal model provided by people like Orban and indeed Donald Trump. Azerbaijan, you could say, is also been ahead of the game in advance of this, because it's also been skeptical of liberal order, of multilateralism, of international institutions. 10, 15 years ago, this is indicative. Azerbaijan celebrated being chairman of the Council of Europe, the human rights organization. Nowadays, Azerbaijan denounces the Council of Europe and says it's an unrepresentative, interfering body. So a complete 180-degree turn in Azerbaijan attitudes and language about the Council of Europe. Same on OSCE and indeed United Nations. So message you got very early from Azerbaijan is that these multilateral organizations do not deliver. They very much instrumentalized this in saying that they did not help us solve the Karabakh conflict. Obviously, those organizations would push back and say, you, Azerbaijan, also had to do things within a multilateral framework to resolve that conflict. But this is very much the discourse used by President Aliyev that these multilateral organizations have failed. Increasingly, they talk about regional organizations. Obviously, they have a strong bilateral relationship with Turkey, who's their closest ally. The Erdogan-Aliyev relationship is close, although not without a few problems. And also quite a strong relationship with Russia, more transactional, but in August, President Vladimir Putin made a state visit to Baku. Very few places outside Russia where he could make a state visit and get a fairly friendly reception. Azerbaijan is one of them. Azerbaijan has supported this so-called 3+3 initiative in which Russia, Turkey, and Iran are seen as the kind of regional guarantors for the South Caucasus, which is rejected so far by Georgia, which wants to see the West there. The Armenians do not like it either, although they do participate. Azerbaijan is the strongest advocate of this regional format, which you might call a kind of axis of illiberalism. So in this sense, Azerbaijan, I think, if you see what's happened in Azerbaijan, you can see trends which are now repeating themselves elsewhere. If in Georgia, earlier this year, it passed the so-called foreign influence, foreign agents law, which heavily restricts and punishes non-governmental organizations who receive Western funding. Azerbaijan, basically 10 years ago, shut down all its Western-funded NGOs already 10 years ago. Actually, they, in the 2000s, easy to forget, in the 1990s, all these National Endowment for Democracy, Human Rights Watch, various OSCE bodies, but all had offices in Azerbaijan. But that trend, that is obviously yesterday. They were all shut down about 10 years ago. So let me say just a few words about the political system. President Aliyev has been in power, as you know, since 2003, was re-elected beginning of this year for a fifth term in office, which actually can last 7 years. So there is no functional opposition in Azerbaijan. It is basically a one-party state. Which is not to say that, in fact, because of his actions in the Karabakh War, President Aliyev does not have, domestic support and legitimacy. Absolutely, he does, but it's very hard to test that in the conditions of a one-party state where media is controlled by the state, where there's basically no functional opposition, where rule of law is extremely weak. I think the big change in the last 10 years has been that oil and gas revenues have declined, in particular oil revenues. Azerbaijan now very much relies on gas, which is a less profitable resource than oil. Oil revenues have been in decline. And in this, and there's less room for sharing out the spoils. There's basically one ruling party and one ruling family in charge, who is in fact associated more with the First Lady Mehriban Aliyeva Pashayeva than with President Aliyev, and their control, they very much control the many of the businesses in Azerbaijan. Jody, who's written a excellent report for Carnegie, which will come out next week, I'm sure we'll say more about this. So this I think is broadly the situation, but of course there are many questions about the sustainability of a one-party state in which inevitably the longer it stays in power loses touch with the popular pulse, doesn't have feedback mechanisms, doesn't have access to good information, and in the case of Azerbaijan has to deal with an energy transition from reliance on its main resources of oil and gas. Again, I'm sure Jody will have things to say about this. So a combination, as we see in many states, of extreme confidence. Azerbaijan is holding COP29, the climate change conference in November in Baku, which is a kind of symptom of its effective use of cultivating links both in Europe, Russia, Middle East, and Asia, that it's able to chair COP. There's a confidence there, a confidence born also of having completely defeated the Armenians between 2020 and 2023, resolved that long-running conflict with the Armenians brutally, violently, and in Azerbaijan's favor, a conflict in which there was justice and injustice on both sides, but Azerbaijan has now prevailed in that conflict. So there's a confidence, but also an insecurity about what happens next. This, I think, makes for a regime which is very afraid of any whispers of regime change, has jailed a lot of people, including some quite marginal people in the last year. Many people who really were not very active even in politics have been arrested in the last year. So we're seeing a crackdown on criticism also in Azerbaijan. Cengiz gave me a time warning, so why don't I stop there and pass it back to you, Cengiz?
Yes, thank you, Tom. I will take one or two questions for you. I have one, and I will abuse my position. How you explain this sympathy, if not love, of the liberal Europeans for Mr. Aliyev? Although, I mean, this love is in the descending, path nowadays, especially with the European Parliament's resolution, etc. But still, I mean, von der Leyen likes very much Aliyev, no?
I would say it's more transactional than that, Cengiz. I think there is obviously, for sure, when I've given some lectures on Azerbaijan in recent years, I've shown 3 slides. One of from 2021, which is Presidents Aliyev and Erdogan meeting in Shusha in Karabakh, signing an agreement in the summer of 2021. The next one is February 2022, Aliyev in Moscow signing an agreement with Putin. He was actually the last person, I think, to be received by foreign leader to receive by Putin before the invasion of Ukraine. And then July 2022, von der Leyen in Baku signing a gas agreement with Azerbaijan. I do think the Azerbaijanis are extremely clever at talking to different audiences, talking, fluently and persuasively in English to Westerners, and then in Russian to the Russians, and in Turkish Azeri to the Turks. And people should, I think, read and watch more closely what they say to each partner, because the message is often quite different. But for sure, I think a lot of people in Europe were in a panic in 2022 about the cutoffs of Russian gas to Europe. And von der Leyen, I think most people agree it was now rather hasty, flew to Baku and signed an agreement to try and double Azerbaijani exports of gas to the EU. I think most people think the targets there are unrealistic. But I think EU is actually quite divided on Azerbaijan. Italy, Bulgaria, Greece, indeed, import quite a lot of Azerbaijani gas. But for northern EU, I think Azerbaijan is looks very different. They criticize its human rights record. They're critical of its close relationship with Russia. Um, they also remember the so-called caviar diplomacy, which affected European Parliament and Council of Europe. So I think there's quite a bit of division in Europe, and I think there was also some criticism from von der Leyen about the visit to Baku. Clearly, I'm not saying that extra Azerbaijani gas is not welcome, but the optics, as we say, of it flying to Baku, I wouldn't, and the friendly appearance with President Aliyev, I think, was not helpful, to put it mildly, when there are many issues which I've mentioned, where you want to be more critical of Azerbaijan.
Any questions to Tom de Waal? I don't see any hands, but yes, Selçuk Gültaşlı. Yes, please, you have the floor, Selçuk.
Thank you very much, Professor de Waal. Thanks indeed. If I understood you correctly, you said Azerbaijan is a model for Georgia. I thought Georgia's model was European Union or Russia. Can you please elaborate on that?
I'm saying, well,
just a second. Just a second,
Right.
Tom. I will also take the question of Bülent.
Sure.
Yeah, I just want to ask you about the position of the opposition in Azerbaijan. We know that there is a very, how could I say, colorful opposition, but they have no effect over the regime. What do you see about the future or trajectory of the Azerbaijani opposition to more effective over the regime?
Right. Thank you for those two questions. Yeah, and of course, when we talk about we have to be careful in all discussions like this when we say Azerbaijan, Georgia, to make a distinction between the country and the ruling party, the government in power. When I say Azerbaijan is a model for Georgia, it's obviously not a model for most Georgians. It's a model for the Georgian Dream ruling party, which does not represent all Georgians, and I'm sure did not win a majority in the election. So I think what they like to see in Azerbaijan is a non-aligned country, a country which has managed to be friendly simultaneously with its neighbors, including Russia, and keep some ties with the West, but in particular with certain European countries, such as Hungary. I think that is the model. It's a kind of sovereigntist model where sovereignty is a higher virtue than democracy or openness, and sovereignty is used not as a kind of shorthand for being able to do what you like within your borders and rejecting all international criticism. So I think that's why I mentioned that. Clearly, for most Georgians, poll after poll shows that they aspire to a European future. The Azerbaijani opposition, I'm not, I think there is an old, if you'll recall that there was, for 1 year, a kind of nationalist democratic government in Azerbaijan, quite incompetent, but quite pluralist, 92-93, led by the nationalist leader Abulfaz El-Chibay. And most of the opposition still survives from that period. The Popular Front, the Musavat Party, they still the kind of inheritors of that opposition. But I think that electorate has got old, to be brutally honest. Is not, they have not moved on. I don't think most Azerbaijanis look to them as a credible alternative. But so I think it's not really possible to talk about an opposition in Azerbaijan where the space for opposition is pretty small. Clearly, at some point there will be a different kind of government in Azerbaijan, but the change is most likely to come, like in most of these regimes, probably at the top rather than from the bottom.
Thank you, Tom. I don't see any other hands and risen. Am I right, Bülent? Do you see any other questions? No.
No.
All right. Thank you, Tom. You are
Yeah,
welcome
with
to
apologies.
stay with us, but thank you.
I might try and rejoin you a bit later, but I do have to go. Thank you so much.
Very good. Thank
Okay,
you.
bye-bye.
Now
Bye-bye.
let's go to the hotspot, Georgia. As I indicated in the beginning, and let's start with Dr. David Aprazidze, who will examine the evolution of populism in Georgia. David, you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Aktar, and I also would like to join Tom, who left us, and express my gratitude to the organizers of this event. Well, it's encouraging news that you found the Georgian participants talking about Georgia, and I hope that it will remain like this in years to come. Well, you have mentioned that, yes, today Georgia is in a hotspot. It's a very, as you mentioned earlier, burning place. A couple of days ago on Sunday, we had elections, and the results are, contested, domestically and internationally as well. In my view, and I want to make this statement quite straightforward, these elections were neither free nor fair. But of course, elections is something different, and if the questions from the audience will come, I and my colleague from Georgia, another David, will try to reply to them. Nevertheless, this statement that the elections were not free and fair brings me to my main point for today. You mentioned that it's widely acknowledged that populism undermines the liberal democracy everywhere, even in the functioning democracies, because it's deteriorating its quality and it's challenges the liberal norms. But you also would agree that in hybrid regimes or the semi-free or semi-closed countries like Georgia, the impact is far, far damaging. Because populism suspends, populism reverses the process of democratization. It kills erodes the nascent, very weak institutions, which is very much needed for democracy to grow. It corrupts weakened, fragmented political actors. That's exactly what's happening currently in Georgia, right? I mean, Tom mentioned that Georgia's opposition is functioning, but it's in a great danger, because if this government remains in power, we already see that next institutional steps will be to eradicate, to minimize, to squeeze the space for the opposition, to take air from the political oppositions. Then it demoralizes also the public, because we had quite strong public response when the authorities introduced the law on foreign agents. Tom already mentioned this back in a couple of months ago, in beginning March, April of this year. But actually, you do not feel the energy anymore in the society to go to streets, to protest against the stolen elections, even though there was a big manifestation. But I do not expect that this will continue. So it's the demoralization, or the taking out the spirit of resistance from the society. This is also what populism actually produces in these hybrid regimes. In other words, populism in countries like Georgia, it equals autocracy. It's just another form of authoritarian rule. This is all the observation. The outcome of the populism is not unique to any single form of populism. Well, let's look at the Georgian dream, and the Georgian dream is actually the main protagonist of my presentation today, the ruling party of Georgia. How the Georgian dream started? The Georgian dream started as a left-leaning, bread and butter issue-based populist party, and we saw the gradual transformation from this left-leaning angle or the position towards a more radical, conservative, nationalist, nativist, anti-liberal version of populism. In 2012, when the Georgian Dream won elections and was regarded as a very progressive force back then, including by even both domestically and internationally, this party was actually part of the observer of the Party of European Socialists. 10 years after they left this leftist camp, and they joined the conservative political or radical conservative political grouping led by Hungary, right? And they departed from this bread and butter socialist kind of terminology and issues, and now they're underlying it, and now they are promoting the values of family, of religion, and decrying so-called LGBT propaganda. Right? The similar shift occurred in the foreign policy of Georgia, or the foreign policy presented by led by the Georgian Dream. In 2014, the same party succeeded in signing the association agreement with the European Union. 2017, the same party managed to negotiate the visa-free regime with the European Union, so the ordinary Georgians can travel without visa in the countries of the Schengen zone. In 2020, they promised that Georgia would become a member of the European Union. Indeed, the war in Ukraine accelerated this process, and the Georgia got the candidate status in 2023. So everybody would expect from that same party that they would embrace this new opportunity, would implement the reforms, would open up to the advices or the policy suggestions coming from the European Union. But the contrary happened. I mean, the very much known concept in the Europeanization or the EU enlargement that membership perspective is the most attractive, let's say, component of pursuing winning the reformists. But from Turkey, we know that that is not always the case, and exactly the same happened also in Georgia. The Georgian Dream, the same party I mentioned a couple of years ago, actually was leading Georgia on this European path, started attacking the European Union and claiming, I have to quote, that illiberal mainstream captured the European Union, has captured the European Union, US, and all countries in the Western Europe. Global party of war, that's the term coined by the leader of this of the party, honorary chairman of the party, and one of the most influential decision maker in Georgia, Bizina Ivanishvili. So it was the question that Tom mentioned Azerbaijan as the model state of Georgia, and there was a question made that the participant of our workshop questioned this. Actually, Hungary is the model country for current Georgian, let's say, authorities. Viktor Orban is the major mentor of our authorities, and Tom also mentioned that 2 days after elections, Viktor Orban rushed to Tbilisi to congratulate Georgian Dream with the victory, which is well, as I already mentioned, contested and not recognized by the majority of the international community. Well, how we explain this transition, how we explain this transformation of the Georgian dream, and I would also like to use the remaining time also to compare the populism in the Georgian colors with what we know from the Western Europe. The first observation is that it's about power. I mean, it's about the primary objective has always been to gain and maintain power. And the Georgian dream realized that a conservative right-wing platform is easier to capitalize on while mobilizing the supporters than the left wing. And this, by the way, is in agreement with the broader trend in Western democracies that the support for populist parties comes not from, let's say, political economic grievances, but actually comes from the cultural concerns. The second moment is that populism has become a well-organized, and we see this in Georgia, well-organized transitional phenomenon. Processes or the concepts like, the diffusion of ideas, learning, promotion that we have always associated with the democratization is equally applicable now to the democratization, to autocratization. 2016, Yaroslav Kaczynski told Viktor Orban, I read in one of articles, that, I quote, "You have set an example and we are learning from it." So the Georgian Dream leadership could repeat proudly the same statement because, as I mentioned already, Viktor Orban is the figure, the mentor, the person who people or the leadership of the Georgian Dream admires very much. The third observation is that as part of this learning process, populist parties adopt similar, the narratives to mobilize their own supporters, but also to discourage the opposition, so discourage the public from supporting the opposition. And this is mostly the cultural identity-based, both group and individual identity-based narratives. And what is very important also, it is depicting the West or the liberal West being in decline. So portraying the West as someone where there is no leadership anymore and which is inevitably condemned to decay. However, I repeat, in democracies, countries like France, Germany, Sweden, elsewhere, there are still various institutions. There are still variety of actors, political, societal, business actors. And therefore, the effect, this damaging effect of populism can be moderated. I might be too optimistic, correct me, but this is how we see this from this periphery. And even if populist parties manage to come to power, they somehow try to adjust to this liberal institutional framework, these constraints. So we have what we have seen in Italy, in Netherlands, in other parts of the Western Europe. In hybrid regimes, however, the outcome is, as I already outlined, I mean, it's really killing every prospect of democracy. Because, and that's what the Georgian Dream has already done during this 12 years of its reign and will continue for sure if it remains in power, it captures institutions, rewrites the rules of game to its own favor, adjusts electoral systems, uses, by the way, modern technologies in its own favor, restricts the media, restricts the civil services, captures the judiciary, kills civil society, subordinates the businesses. Actually, it means that piece by piece, it kills every possible actor or institution capable to resist this authorization or authorization. Well, to conclude the story of Georgian populism, and David will complement me with this nationalistic narrative, which I missed on purpose because his presentation will be on that topic. So the story of populism in Georgia is, unfortunately, so far, it's a story of failed democratization. It underscores that populism, again, in hybrid regimes is far more damaging than it is in established democracies. So I will stop here. And once again, thank you for your attention and thank you for having me on this panel.
Thank you, David. Before continuing with your colleague, the other David, I would like to underline this extremely important message as far as I'm concerned. You told us that the effects of populism are exacerbated in the hybrid regimes where the institutions are weak and they cannot resist the push of the populist politicians. And the first thing they do is actually to transform these weak institutions for their for their purpose and for the strengthening of their political power. I mean, it's extremely worrisome, and it's across the board actually. And what you were telling us is valid also for Hungary. You know, Hungary didn't have proper, strong, institutions. I mean, mind you, it's a post-Soviet country. You know, its advantage is that it's joined the EU, and it has given the impression that it's a functioning democracy. Not at all. David, anyhow, you have the floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for having me. Thank you for David introducing the Georgian context under the Georgian Dream. But firstly, before also sharing my points on Georgian Dream, I will provide the, let's say, simplified schema how populism works in Georgia since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And basically, the good story would be how to look it through populism from populist literature, to take the concept of the empty signifier and what was filling the empty signifier, or has been filling the empty signifier from the early 90s down to 2012 when Ivanishvili or Georgian Dream came into power. To simplify the story, the first president, Gamsahurdia, was very successful because against communist regime, he filled the signifier with the idea of the nationalist mobilization under the cause of independence. And then, okay, it's another story that nationalist, because of the context of the region and part of the history that was active nationalist, which led to the disastrous consequences because of other conditionalities around. But he was successful and he secured the independence of the country. Let's exclude the other modalities that it was not exceptional, but are the trend of the breakup of the socialist regimes around the region or Eurasian region. The second president, Gamsa Shevardnadze, he was successful because actually when after the coup d'etat he arrived, or he was invited by military council from Moscow. Actually, he arrived and he filled the empty signifier with the idea of the order and stability. This is what was badly needed in the Georgian society after the civil war in Tbilisi, wars in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, let's say devastating blow to the first years of independence. And he succeeded, and he was more or less successfully driving the countries, injecting, let's say, the pro-Western idea of the pro-Western orientation, very pragmatic, not ideal, I would say, because that was lately added by Saakashvili, but he lasted until the 2003 when he was ousted by Saakashvili, because Saakashvili was kindly fits within this idea of filling empty signifier, because he first started with the idea of combating corruption. This is what eating us. Without combating corruption, we don't have any future prospect. And then he also brought the idea, and that was also momentum external momentum created with the democracy promotion project under the George W. Bush administration. And then he succeeded. And then Georgian Dream appeared in 2012, and this is very symptomatic. This is what started, and this is what I see, how successful they are when Ivanishvili appeared, and basically what they offered to fill in the empty signifier. This is bringing dignity back to the people. How Georgian dignity is stripped off, let's say, under the regime of Saakashvili. This is nothing new. This is how, according to one stream mainstream literature and populist studies, the changing regimes, rotation, elites, anti-elites, bad elites, good elites, rotating works, could be understood in the Georgian case. But the basic problem, why they are so successful, why this change happened, and let's have doubt to what extent this change will happen, and that's why so far how that is very hard by any opposition leader to change the regime of Ivanishvili. If they will succeed to maintain the power, they will run the country for the fourth term in office. This is something unimaginable for the post-Soviet Georgia. No leader succeeded in that. Taking the basic point to ideas that in the Georgian case, the politics has always been personalized. It was about the strong leader and its party built around the leader, and only party which succeeded without leader, that was the United National Movement, which they, in the second term of Ivanishvili, split into two, about the strong leader, and then basically all came to consolidate around the leader. And in that, actually, we could see how gradually David provided in our outlook how those happened in the European countries, the rise of populists from the left or from the right. But in Georgian case, that is very symptomatic. And he also mentioned how successfully Georgian Dream, and that is about strategy and tactics under populism. The leadership is switching between from the left to the right to feed those signifiers, to maintain the consolidation of the people around themselves. And basically, that's also a story how Georgian Dream, especially during the last 4-year term in office, especially after 2022, when the, let's say, second wave, hot phase of the conflict started in Ukraine, actually inserted the images, practical images you could see on the posters before the elections, and also the rhetoric to let's say, frighten the population with the war. And in the rhetoric, that's also very leitmotiv what we could see from prime ministers, and there was a rotation of prime minister by Ivanishvili, but both of them maintained the main slogan, long-lasting peace with Russia, happened under the Georgian Dream rule. All previous leadership had one way or another the war with Russia. And this is something on top of that, they have successfully capitalized. And then basically it would be very helpful actually to dive deep how basically the power was hijacked, institutions were undermined in classical case for colonial albeit successfully in Hungary, changing electoral procedures and formula, also very successfully in Hungary, in Poland, and so on and so forth, although there was a return of democracy, for example, in Poland, in Czech Republic. Orban, so far so good, stands firmly. And here we see how actually Georgian Dream tries, and to some extent this brings legitimization to him in the eye of the electorate, how they successfully question or undermine gradually the pro-Western orientation of the country, because with the populist conservative narrative and that swing from left-wing to populist conservative drive, they successfully injected the duality of the European Union in the eyes of the Georgian electorate, that is juxtaposing Brussels with Budapest. Both of them are Europe, and they provide the question, they set the question, what is the Europe we are adhering towards? This is Brussels, liberal, neglecting the traditional Christian family values, or Budapest, which Viktor Orban, who is Comrade Orban, standing firmly, defending the traditional image or traditions of Europe, not EU but Europe. So this is very symptomatic. External discourse brought into domestic discourse, which is successfully tailored or adjusted to the domestic narrative of Georgian Orthodoxy, which is attacked from the outside, basically by EU, which is rotten due to their ultra or how to say fully fledged drive towards the liberal ideas, and with this they actually question and bifurcate the Georgian audience, and with that they successfully find the different segments of the society. So if we go to the idea of democracy, classical Rokanian cleavages, which has never been consistent in the Georgian case, or in the case of Georgia, and then if we juxtapose it to the Kreisel, who is talking about demarcation, integration, cleavages, the demarcation, integration, cleavages is successfully deployed by Georgian Dream, internally and externally juxtaposing those different discourses. On the other hand, the main leitmotif is dignity of the people, but that swing from left-wing populism will bring back old-time social security and safety. And I could recall what was the basic, very populist, unrealistic promise given in 2012, in literal sense, that was that electricity will cost 10 tetri, gas would cost 5 tetri, and water will be free of charge because it comes into the tap. And yes, it's unbelievable, but basically you see the modern rhetoric what was there, and basically when you could deliver realistically that promise, you could bring something to feed the audience. And with this populist, conservative, orthodox religious axis of this new policy, defending an overarching theme, defending the sovereignty versus Brussels, not versus Russia, because we are 20% occupied, coupled with thermal gaining, is very much successful so far in the case of Georgia under the Georgian Dream rule. Although I would say whether Georgian Dream emulates Belarus, his model is Batka, or no. His model is Putin, and basically they are playing with the Putin's playing. And basically what they are driving under populist conservative drive, aligning with Budapest, this is something what is called recently emerging in the Western discourse. This is the concept of neonationalism or new nationalism, played in the line of the illiberal democracy. And what we see both in Central Eastern Europe, in our case as well, we are in between in a sense, not radically diverging from democracy. Well, we never achieved the phase of consolidated democracy towards autocracy, but still maintaining the group, what is called the hybrid regimes, through shifting those different characters in terms of building alliance with the champion of liberal democracy in the Central Eastern Europe, and with that they are very successful in the towards the domestic audience. But the problem, what David was talking about, the institutional manipulation part of the populist regime, what we could see how gradually, what Kagan said, the demise of democracy, he allegorically termed that jungle grows back. We do see how gradually the jungle comes, not undermining any opportunity of free expression, but attacking here and there and copy-pasting from Putin's playbook. For example, the first one, anti-LGBT law. The second one, draft law on NGOs. By the way, selling that draft law as FARA, which was institutionalized in the United States during the Second World War. So we are doing the same. This is what democracies are defending themselves. We will do the same. But in its nutshell, we do see how they are gradually also trying to test to what extent they could undermine the spaces of critical thinking. Lately, there was the case through institutional means how institution of my colleague Ilia State University was attacked by the leadership of the Georgian Dream. And this is very symptomatic that if they will hold the power, they will try to undermine, to monopolize the power over the public spaces where the contestation or the foundations of the deliberative democracy could work. Do I have some more time? Then I will question what might be the prospect of Georgia at present. So far, I'm just looking at the process, what opposition will do, to what extent the opposition will manage to consolidate what they claim to be. That means boycotting the parliament, although this is what they did in 2020 as well, but nothing radical happened out of that. We also tested that mass demonstrations were against the draft law on foreign agents. It did not work. It went into the force, and just before the day of the election, we saw how Atlantic Council, one of the influential local NGOs monitoring the Russian intervention or soft power or misinformation, disinformation interventions in Georgia were attacked and basically tried to crush by the Georgian Dream. So the picture is not very optimistic, and it's also very problematic that with that populist narratives, tactics, with mixed tactics with strategy, they have been and so far are very, very successful. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I mean, what a paradox. Brussels against Budapest and,
domestic discourse.
Of course, but I mean, and he uses and abuses his position as the 6 monthly, chairman of the European Union to jump on the plane and visit
Yes.
anywhere. I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah,
Georgian Dream was very lucky that as well.
Exactly, of course. No, but I mean, what I hear from your talk is that it's this post-Soviet legacy in non-democratic countries has a chilling effect on the political life. I mean, I hear both of you telling us about in the beginning of the successes of the Georgian Dream, and the total 180 degrees shift, and we had a similar trend in Turkey, but also in Hungary and elsewhere. And Slovakia is not far from it. These reformist parties, they are both government and opposition, actually. So, and they fulfill the both tasks. It's amazing because the opposition is so weak. The civil society at the end of the day is so weak that these parties become very quickly hegemonic. And I think Fidesz and the AKP in Turkey are excellent examples of this, paradoxical, totally abnormal political structures that we have to deal with in this region. Okay, thank you to Georgia, and we will continue to follow up, of course. Now let's go back to Azerbaijan to listen first to Jody. Jody, you have the floor. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I have a brief PowerPoint, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see now. So I was asked to discuss a bit my previous work on Azerbaijan's hegemonic authoritarian regime. And so that's essentially what I'm going to do. I've used this as an opportunity to revisit some things I was thinking about in a previous article and try to match them a little bit with what I think Azerbaijan is facing today, given that it's not quite as in the news as Georgia is this week, but with the COP coming up next month, it certainly has been on international observers' radar. So in this sense, I want to start first just by presenting or reviewing a brief conceptual framework that I outlined in my article several years ago on what hegemonic authoritarian regimes are. Just to sort of lay out a framework for thinking about the different range of regimes that we might have. And especially, I think it helps us to see within the post-Soviet framework how Azerbaijan's regime fits in. I'll then talk a little bit more about the mechanisms by which this type of autocracy has been created and sustained in Azerbaijan. And I'd like to conclude with a few brief reflections on how this connects to populism, given that that is technically the theme of the invitation. So I thought I would just offer a few thoughts. So when we're talking about political regimes, and there's obviously many ways we can distinguish regime types and different institutions of political organization. This one is a bit blurry, by the way, and I apologize for that. But one of the most helpful ways of thinking about different types of political regimes for political scientists, at least, focuses on how national level leaders are chosen. So tracing back to some of our core definitions of democracy and autocracy, we might focus on how much competition this process of selecting a country's leaders involves. So here we have a typology that's laid out of different types of regimes that are essentially ordered in terms of, in this case, at least on my screen, the right-hand side of the screen, moving from low levels of competition up all the way down to cases of liberal democracy where there's very high levels of competition. And so what I've done here on this slide is just summarize in a less blurry and larger way this dimension of competition across political regimes. So we might distinguish between closed authoritarianism on one end of the spectrum, where there's no elections or where the opposition is legally as well as practically banned, from more hybrid types of regimes, including competitive and hegemonic authoritarianism, where we do see elections, but we get, they're still not fair, and we get different levels of competition, some sort of contestation, even if it's not entirely a level playing field. And then, of course, we can distinguish those types of authoritarianism or non-democracy from gradations of democracy itself, where the elections are free and fair, and to varying degrees, civil rights, political liberties, and the rule of law is protected. Now, what I want to highlight in this particular slide is the difference between hegemonic authoritarianism and competitive authoritarianism. Because in the study of hybrid regimes and in the study of post-Soviet regimes, over the past 10 to 15 years, at least within political science and conceptually, there's been a lot of interest in these competitive authoritarian regimes where you get elections that take place on an unlevel playing field, but there's still some level of competition. The opposition is still, a player in the game and allowed to at least participate. Whereas what I argue is that Azerbaijan doesn't fit that model. And of course, as time has gone on, this has become, I think, more evident than it may have been when I first started working on it. But I argue that Azerbaijan is, in fact, a case where we have these elections, but opposition, even if it may not be legally and institutionally banned, doesn't pose a real threat in any sort of way. So they're not really meaningfully competing for power and only existing in the most nominal senses. So I think this typology and moving from just, democracy versus autocracy helps us to unpack that messy middle between democracy and autocracy, which in turn helps us to understand the post-Soviet regimes more generally, especially in the South Caucasus. And it establishes that these hybrid regimes exist and that they're conceptually distinct from either closed authoritarianism or democratic contexts. But it also acknowledges that even within that category of hybrid regimes, there's a variety of different types of politics that might make up that middle category. And as I said, it makes a meaningful distinction in terms of what we might expect politically between competitive authoritarian regimes versus hegemonic authoritarian regimes. And I think that's important given that these are the two most common regime types in our region of study. And hegemonic regimes are more consolidated, we might think of as forms of autocracy, or more closed forms, wherein the rulers are better able to avoid these regime cycles of patronal politics, these kinds of moments of instability that we see or did see in places like Georgia and Ukraine during the color revolutions. But also these regimes are more robust, they're more durable and less prone to seeing or being threatened by opposition challenges. So yes, so I stick Azerbaijan into the hegemonic authoritarian category. And what I want to talk about for the rest of this talk is how Azerbaijan managed to create this hegemonic authoritarian regime. So this is going to be a bit less contemporary than our discussion of Georgia over the past few minutes, because I think we can ask this question of how this paradox exists. How are the presence of organized legal opposition parties and a government that continues to win an overwhelming victory in elections both possible? How do these two conditions cohabitate in a very stable way? And we might think about some common explanations that make this puzzle seem not so puzzling. So for example, we might point to vote fraud to explain this overwhelming victory. And I think, obviously across these regimes and across these cases, including in Azerbaijan, this is part of the story, of course. But at the same time, vote fraud only goes so far in explaining the stability of Azerbaijan's regime. The government does have popularity, and as we've seen, overt vote fraud can lead to political crisis. We also might point to the mechanisms of co-optation and distribution of patronage, but that raises a lot of questions about who is being co-opted, who is receiving patronage. And at least in Azerbaijan, it certainly is not the opposition parties. Rather, instead, they get cut out of politics altogether. So they're very much excluded instead of included and bought off. And the third explanation that we often point to, that again has some validity, but I think is not the entire story, and certainly not in creating Azerbaijan's regime in the first place, is that of outright repression, which in turn requires a high level of state capacity and is in fact quite difficult to do with what we might call inherited opposition parties. That is to say, those opposition parties that the ruler inherited from a previous moment that predate the institution of the current regime. It's easier, of course, to nip things in the bud with new opposition that might emerge. But that, in fact, wasn't quite the situation in the early years of Azerbaijan's regime. Instead, what I argue is that in creating this stable autocracy, Azerbaijan's rulers quite effectively and successfully marginalized the existing opposition parties, the ones that they inherited from the previous political moment. So President Heydar Aliyev and then centrally Ilham Aliyev faced this challenge of what to do with an opposition that already existed. And that specifically refers to the members of the Popular Front government that had power from 1992 to 1993. And it went on to include the successor parties of the Azerbaijan Popular Front Party, Musavat, the ANIP are some of the more prominent names here. And so I argue that from the mid-1990s, and especially once Ilham Aliyev came to power, the government used formal and informal measures to prevent these parties from actually functioning as political parties. So they're allowed to exist, but they're not allowed to perform the political party the functions that we associate with political parties. So here I have just a quick chart of the three core functions that I identify of political parties, of both of first aggregating and articulating the interests in society and formulating them into a platform, as well as competing in elections and serving in government in order to affect policy, combined with just a quick summary on the right-hand side of the practices that we saw in Azerbaijan through the 1990s and the 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s, when it was most active in terms of trying to prevent these functions from being achieved or performed by the opposition. So preventing them from meeting with citizens in a large-scale way, making it very difficult to compete in elections, and even if they could register, preventing them from campaigning. And finally, as the outcome of these elections, the opposition parties were given very few seats in parliament and were not able to influence political debate or win policy concessions. So they were allowed to exist, and they could meet with international observers, they could meet with foreign researchers, but they were effectively, even outside of the election moments, prevented from performing their core functions. And so by the late 2000s, the inherited opposition in particular was still technically legal, but had become ineffective and invisible to society. And so these policies and practices in Azerbaijan created what I claim is a no-win situation for the individuals associated with these parties. So as one person told me in a previous round of field research, so many people from the former Popular Front government are now unemployed, but the current government is happy with this, and it uses it against them, saying, look, these guys, they've been sitting at home, they haven't even been doing anything. This guy isn't qualified to be in politics. He's been unemployed for 15 years. In some cases, saying like, well, why would you elect or why would you vote for a guy who's been driving a taxi for 15 years? Because they've been effectively shut out from doing almost anything else. So this was effectively contained the inherited opposition and slowly eroded their legitimacy. But it was also combined with active repression of any emergent opposition, especially youth groups and youth activists, as well as increasingly putting the screws on civil society and just more general intimations of political activism. And so the end result of both containing and eroding the existing opposition, but also preventing any new, more exciting opposition from emerging in Azerbaijan, produced a situation where we had and still have disengaged citizens who see effectively an absence of alternatives, of legitimate and capable alternatives. And so as one person told me, and this was back in 2008, but I don't think this has changed. This person said, yeah, I voted for Ilham Aliyev. Why? Because he's the only capable candidate, as far as I see. And the context of this conversation shows that, this person, it wasn't that they thought he was particularly capable. It just suggested that there wasn't anybody else that had any possible capabilities. So that leads me to the question of why was this possible? Under what conditions can we get this kind of regime consolidation as we did in Azerbaijan? And I think in Azerbaijan, it certainly was enabled by the legacy of the political events, the instability, the memories of the difficulties that the country experienced politically, economically, certainly in terms of international conflicts and whatnot in the late 1980s and the early 1990s that shaped public perceptions. It made this less of a difficult going against the grain for the government. At the same time, oil resources certainly helped because they generated revenue for the state budget, as well as rents and patronage in exchange for political loyalty. But in my mind, I think one of the most important factors is not the oil resources per se, but actually the fact that the Azerbaijan's economy is and has been highly centralized, not just in terms of the oil industry, but the lack of meaningful privatization and autonomous economic resources outside the oil industry meant in turn that the government could control access to who had private business opportunities and make them contingent on political loyalties, as well as had a lot of control over jobs, benefits, and other opportunities for upward mobility, even for the non-elites. So there had to be active or at least tacit support for the incumbent government in order to benefit from some of the economic resources that might be available. So as a result, I mean, I think, and obviously, as I said, this argument goes back to 10 to 20 years ago. But I think that what that moment and that process did is lock in an institutional situation that became much easier to maintain over time. Because what's happening is that we get a lot of regime stability. We haven't seen significant new opposition challenges. And in fact, what instead we're seeing is a further centralization of political and economic life over the past decade since then, including referendum that extended presidential term limits and created the vice presidency, which is filled by, since its inception, the first lady. And increasingly, we have seen ministers being replaced, ministers who had been business elites and conglomerate owners being replaced by technocrats and their conglomerates, their business holdings being absorbed into the ruling family, the Aliyev and the Pashayev business portfolios. So in the present day, there's increasing debate, I think, or meaningful debate from outsiders, at least, about the sustainability of Azerbaijan's political economy model. That's, I think, for observers of Azerbaijan, really where a lot of the debates this year have been focused. And certainly there's a lot of attention on Azerbaijan in light of the fact that they're about to be on the international stage with the COP29. And so as a result, there's concern that, or interest in the role of Azerbaijan's oil resources and their obsolescence, the fact that they won't go on forever, the market implications of climate change and the decline of hydrocarbon demand, as in shaping the amount of rents that are available for distribution to sustain this level of autocracy, or this type of autocracy. So on the one hand, there may be vulnerabilities coming from the political economic model itself, but there's also within Azerbaijan significant economic and social inequalities, in the sense that the benefits of the oil boom haven't been distributed equally, which hypothetically could create space for a demand for more representation or better governance. But I think we also have to recognize that the government has been undertaking quite concerted efforts that would reinforce this existing model, despite those changing circumstances. So these include their shift in the past few years, let's say, to prioritizing gas production, as Tom mentioned, as well as investing in developing their green energy potential, their solar resources and their wind potential. They've also produced these strategic roadmaps that have outlined plans for economic diversification across a number of different priority sectors. And this has included investing in hosting international events, which have included a number of high-profile sporting events, international conferences, and so forth, as well as developing Baku and Azerbaijan more generally as a shipping and transit hub between the Middle East, Asia, and Europe.
Israel.
But these are also sectors in which the ruling elites are themselves invested. So they stand to benefit from this type of economic diversification, which I think raises this question of whether the rentier economy that we see in Azerbaijan that underpins the hegemonic authoritarianism can persist even as oil rents decline. So just as a last set of observations, I challenged myself to think about whether this could be described as populism and whether there's any elements of populism here in this type of authoritarianism and specifically in Azerbaijan. And so, we have a number of different definitions of populism, but to the extent that it can be broadly described as a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who specifically feel excluded and disregarded by the elites and the incumbents. What I think we see in Azerbaijan is it is different in the fact that it's characterized by a real disconnect between politics and the people. And so, and again, this data goes back a while, but Azerbaijani citizens were asked which party best represents their interests and aspirations of people like them, and almost 50% of them said none of the parties. So for Azerbaijan, I think it's less a story about populism and has been for a very long time, and more a story of conscious disconnects here.
Jody, thank you very much for this thorough overview of Azeri authoritarianism. I'm sure we will have many questions. We have still 1 hour and 2 speakers, and let's now turn our spotlights to the last country of the sub-region, Armenia. And I give the floor to Dr. Ashot, who will examine Armenian populism as a risk before Armenia's democratization and EU integration.
So thank you very much.
Yeah, you have the floor. Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. May I share my screen? Okay. Just a moment, please. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I would like also to thank you, the European Center for Populist Studies, for this event. And I think it's a very good opportunity to discussing our regional problems and also the development what we have seen in our region and also about Armenia. So this presentation, I will speak about the populism against post-war Armenia's democratization and European integration. And I think, first of all, about also this theory, I think it's also important because we have seen differences between the populistic activities and also theories, making some definition regarding this post-Soviet, post-communist populistic activity. So in that case, I will, so this is a part of our research, what we are doing with my PhD students. And so since 2018, what we are working on the topic of this political populism in Armenia and also in post-Soviet countries. So we are using this theory and definitions, Reinhard Heinrich and Kasmadi definitions of populism. And both of them, so with making some mentioning importance, the teen-centric, I would say, ideology that divides society, these homogeneous and antagonistic groups. And in that case, the poor people and also on the one side and the corrupt elite in other side, and it wants politics to be the general will of the people. It's more than just a style of politics to get into the power. And secondly, so this is also one. This is it is monist, and it's the sense of society. It's in the terms of homogeneous and monistic group within the same interest and values. And third, that is populist is not only the ideology. So this is also the key distinction is morality. It's more, I would say, describing also these post-Soviet realities about moral. Ricardo is also talking about traditional values and also other activities what we have connected to the morality and politics. So, and about these differences between post-Soviet, Eastern and Western European populists, so I would say that it is the level of establishment of the main political actors. Here we are talking about political parties, NGOs, trade unions, social networks, and movement, media, religious organizations. And also here is the important to take into account the main interest and goals of the political actors, who, how, for what purpose, by what means, where, and for how long uses populism. And here is also important to consider the following dimensions of populism. It's about the legal and political environment, over organizational capacity, financial viability, representativeness and social group, ideology, infrastructure, and political image. So, in this regard, it's also important to consider the process of state building, nation building, which are often opposited, and most importantly, which is often forgotten, even academic discussion, which is also a process of society building. Regarding our reality, post-Soviet reality, and also these Eastern Partnership countries during these European integration processes, we have seen that even this, even also society net building. So in the context of community networks and status stratification, what is also important during this analysis regarding the populist activities. And of particular interest is the topic also of the political leaders, leadership formation, especially in the terms of political parties. Here we can see the gaps and shortcomings of the party in power and ruling party. So this is also one of the main issue in the political agenda of in Armenia and also in other Eastern Partnership countries. So mostly we have party in power and party also in the context of establishing this as an organization infrastructure. But regarding questions, ruling party as they are meaning in the context of West European political culture, I think here also we have seen a lot of difficulties and obstacles. And in terms of state, nation, society building, it is especially the checks and balances of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of governments that also important. So, and about factors that contributing to populism in Armenia, I will, you can see here questions, so list of questions. So, for example, how we can have democratic, legal, social, and sovereign state without the checks and balance of the public power. Or, for example, how we can and how is it possible to have party in power and a ruling party without political party infrastructure, organizational capacity. For example, a lot of political parties in Armenia, we have more than 100 political parties. So, but we can, for us, it is one of the obstacles and problem is that even membership status, or list of membership, these activities, website, bureaus, what they are working, even the room, and that is also shows how they are ready to be part of this, as a political actor, be part of this political life of Armenia. Or another question, how can we have a civil society without society? So first of all, this the questions regarding this status, social groups, social movements. So, and that is also shows that in the context of society relevance, this narrow groups or this parallel this group or social networks is in reality it is impossible to talk also about the established or the establishment civil society or civil society organization. Or another question, how can we, or how it is possible to have liberals, conservative, socialist, rights, left, centrist, etc., without ideology? So ideology also one of the, I would say, this gap of our political reality. So we have, or also I would like to mention once again, more than 100 political parties. And in Armenian case, but we have a problem with ideology of those parties and their activity according these values and principles, dimensions, and the, for example, in liberal ideology, in the framework of liberal ideology, conservative, socialist, or other these activities. Or another questions, how can we, or how is, or is it possible to have voters and electorate? This is also questions of to the political parties because they are taking part in different these election processes, and in the context of this, their competitiveness, their resilience, and this is also one of the gap. So in our political realities, and the war of this, the 44-day war of 2020 or Second Karabakh War, and in wartime and post-war Armenian society, so populist dilemmas such as hero and traitor, or us and them, or the right people or the wrong people, white and black, good and evil, pro-Western, pro-Russian, patriotist of Armenia, patriot of another countries, weak democracy, strong authoritarianism, European unknown integration, and Eurasian brotherhood, etc. In this sense, populists began to calculate in Armenian politics and in the context of conflicts, war, and peace, and the consequences with which were the, I would say, strength hanging of the domestic political influence of populist actors. And in the context of this conflicts, war, and peace, I would like to explain this through the populist triangle, with which represents the combination of conflict, violations, war, and peace factors in the war and peace dimension. So based is the Johann Galtung's theory. So here in the figure 1, you can see this triangle of the populist. This is military, the context of military dimensions of conflict, violence, and peace. And here you will see these attitudes, behavior, and contradiction. And but this is connected, this direct violence, and we will see this all discussion of this agenda among political parties, what are connected with this dimension. They are talking about war building, war making, war keeping in the context of populistic rhetoric. And in the figure 2, I will show you this about also peaceful dimensions. So in the same theories based on Galtung's theory, we will see here also this attitude, contradiction, and behavior regarding these activities and discussions regarding peace building, peacemaking, and peacekeeping, but against the peace, and discussing about peace activities in the context of also the populistic rhetoric. And if you are combining to these, so I will say the dimensions, we will have this another figure or triangle of populism in Armenia. This is about populist keeping, making, and building. So this is, we can see that, so in this context, we have this visible and invisible part of these triangles. And in the context of these activities, for political parties, actors, leaders, what involved in this situation, in the context of self-interest, or this pro-social, collaborative, or intellectual part, they are all discussing issue regarding these populistic activities in Armenia, using also this rhetoric and terminology. What the meaning of that, I would say the main goal is also the keeping and making, building these populistic activities. And according to the post-war situation, I think for Armenian case, it's mostly, in our case, we will use this hybrid populism in Armenia. So not only hybrid war, but also hybrid populism in Armenia. So all issues regarding also the war and peace, and then the visible part or dimension, we will see this war keeping, peacekeeping, discussing all this issue against, for example, peacekeeping situation or war keeping, showing that it is impossible peace because of such kind of reasons and also factors. And in that case, I will say that in the Armenian reality, this post-war situation, mostly we are seeing or analyzing situation or rhetoric, political parties and actors, what they are using these hybrid populist activities in Armenian reality. So in the political populism, it's in that case, in the context of these hybrid activities of populism in Armenia, it's a hybrid game against democracy, against the values, institutions, ideology of democracy. So, and in that case, populism seeks to politically reduce the significance of attacks on democracy because it's a game, and divides its thereby weakening the democracy. And on the other hand, populism is a tangible problem for democracy and political discourse. It aims to destabilize, weaken, or attacks Armenian democratization and European integration, and it often takes advantage of the target states' vulnerabilities. So in the context of also another issue for us, it's a gray zone regime. So Armenian and other post-Soviet countries, mostly it's existing in this gray zone regime. And this describes the set of populist activities that occur between peace and war. It's in the context of cooperation or armed conflicts. So, and we will see that different activities, so this marking between state from anti-government protests and street clashes, economic manipulation and hybrid influence, and also cyber attacks to disinformation. So gray zone populist activities are considered gradual this campaign by unfriendly state and non-state hybrid actors that contribute to combine non-military and quasi-military tools. So in that case, I will show you this pictures, this figure, and here you can see that in the context of the logic gray zone, I will say that it's from confrontation to the armed conflict, or it means it in the context of these activities against this also Armenian democratization and the European integration. In this logic, we will see the hidden, or I will say this shadow and non-formal activities against Armenian European integration and democratization. In that case, so we will see that because of also a lot of factors, so unfortunately this post-war situation, difficulties, lot of activities. So in that logic, in that case, that we will see this gray zone conflict and also this regional hybridism in the context of the Armenian development, also the regional activities, which is discussing also all the issue regarding this populistic rhetorics from the confrontation to armed conflicts. So, and then the next step of our this political populist transition, this was it was the holding of the early parliamentary elections in 2018, in 2021, and the first stages, if in the first stage of Velvet Revolution, Pashinyan's called for the rule of law and non-violent methods of struggle was perceived as a slowing down to this revolutionary process, then the electoral process in December 2018 and June 2021 showed that the political system needs democratization. And this is the result of the early parliamentary election 2018. And here we will see this post-revolutionary Armenians result regarding these activities of political party, what they are taking part of this competitiveness and this fight of these electional processes. And in that case, we will see that also among a lot of parties, what they are taking part in this during these electional processes, using this, how I say, this populistic rhetoric. For example, the previous party in power, Republican Party of Armenia, and other these parties, what they are using also so activities regarding against revolution and democratization, using also anti-European and anti-democratic activities and against in that time against government activities and reform that government trying to do in that time. And this is the post-war situation. That is first election after the war 2020, after 44 war, and this is early parliamentary elections in 2020. In that case, we will see that society so supports the ruling party, and civil contract received the more than how I say this constitutional majority in that case, and it's what it once again shows that in the society, so there are support activities, governmental party and government to make changes in that direction and deepening European integration and democratization in Armenia. So, and then main methodology, what we are doing for researching this populism it is, I would say, this textual analysis. This is, we are using by political text. So mostly it is speeches, articles, comments, interviews, statement, publications, etc. And the key text of main leaders of the political parties and their alliances, also post-war Armenia, when the new post-revolutionary parliament was formed as a result of early parliamentary election, were selected. It was selected for the studies. And the criteria for selecting political leaders and their alliances are mostly participation in parliamentary election and its activity in political life for Armenia. So in that case, as a result of this, of the evolution of the text, politicians and also text of politicians were classified according to the level. So three levels. This is first, it's non-populist and partially populist and populist, and based on this calculation are drawn based on the studied materials classifying the main discourses of the populist rhetoric of Armenian politicians. So, and then according to the criteria of political populism, the following can be distinguished. This also we are using on trying to analyze text and activities of different political parties of Armenia, mostly that is civil contract, prosperous Armenia, bright Armenia, Republican Party of Armenia, so Armenian Revolutionary Federation, other these activities, and also political movement. For example, it's one of the active movement is the post-war situation in Armenia. So one of the this, I would say, the homeless salvation, this movement was one of the most active organizations in the post-war period, led by former Prime Minister of Armenia, Vazgen Manukyan, as well as the Taush for the Motherland movement, and the struggle movement is led by Archbishop Bagrat Galestanian. So an external factor also in the context of influence, the rise of this, I would say, post-war populism in Armenia. First of all, this coronavirus pandemic, and then biosecurity crisis around the world and also in Armenia. It's escalating Russian-West conflict, and also this war Russians against Ukraine, and the primacy of the Russians' interest of the against normalization of Armenian Azerbaijan and Armenian Turkey relations, because if it were possible to negotiate with Azerbaijan without war, and then only that case without it be possible to reduce also the hostility of enmity of the between two nations. And Russia, as an ally of Armenia, refused to implement its security obligation to Armenia, which made Armenian security system vulnerable. And also we will see that war imposed on Armenia, this against the European integration, was delayed, and democratization in Armenian case is weakened. And in the context of European integration, it's important for Armenia in the context of this democratization and modernization of our political system and also regime in Armenia. So in the new, I will say, threats that are on the agenda include also the hybrid war against Armenia by the side of Russia, Turkey, and Azerbaijan, which pose new types and threats in the Eastern Partnership space.
Ashot, please wrap up, because we
Okay.
have largely exceeded our time. Thank you.
Okay, good. Yes, it's the last slide. So and then against so I will say mention here so especially the questions regarding this how I say this activities against Armenian European integration, and this how I say the limitation or framing activities in that context from the negative impact for geopolitical, economic, and humanitarian point of view, and trying to limited or framing these activities in that direction. So this is the last slide, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ashot. Frankly, your questions about the factors contributing to populism in Armenia are more than fundamentals. They are existential. I like very much your formula, civil society without society. I'm sure we will talk about this.
Okay.
I rush to invite our last speaker, Nerses Kopalyan. Let's gain time and let's listen to him immediately before going to the questions and answers. Nerses, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure being here. And this is indeed an important conversation where we're seeing the confluence of populism and democratic backsliding. What I'm going to do is basically address the broader contours of populism as it specifically pertains to Armenia, and kind of navigate how this has punctured or failed to puncture important components of Armenia's democratization process, specifically what we call syndromes of democratic culture. Mainly, Armenia undertook a democratic breakthrough in an authoritarian orbit. So the exogenous factors of the structural components of the South Caucasus already makes the process of democratizing and combating populism difficult as is. As Ashot extensively presented, the security environment is also not conducive to democratization. But amidst the security crisis and sort of a broad structural limitations that are not conducive to democratization, Armenia has actually made important inroads. And this is largely due to basically three main factors. One, in essence, this is the subject of conversation today, populism has failed to take up root in Armenia. And generally, when we talk about populism, this is specific to the political leadership. And in Armenia, it has failed to take up root. Second, we have seen the development of a democratic political culture that, aside from the fact that institutional reforms might have been relatively slower and that consolidation hasn't been achieved because it's still in the transitional process, political culture has reinforced these kind of factors. And third, Armenia's civil society. It was loosely mentioned, but the number one source of combating weaponization of populism and the hybridization of cultural wars and all these other components that we discuss is the strength of civil society. And Armenia, in that sense, has been rather lucky to have a robust civil society that has served as a guardrail against those developments. And so, when we look at populism as a broad or mass political movement, right, a strategy that seeks to use collective action to take power by appealing to the masses, this has not been observable in Armenia. When we look at, for example, the contours of populism in Europe or in the United States, populism is generally equated with anti-immigration and xenophobic nationalism. Or when we look at in Latin America, populism is generally equated with clientelism and economic mismanagement. None of these tend to be attributes that we find in Armenia's political discourse or in policymaking. And so when populism is presented as sort of this emancipatory force, where liberal democracy is deemed the problem and radical democracy is the solution, this attempt at challenging the establishment, even though most populists are part of the establishment, or that trying to mobilize excluded sectors of society into forms of advocates for these populist ideas that are being reinforced by the government in power, none of this has basically taken root in Armenia. So contextually speaking, the illiberal policies that most populist leaders utilize, such as introducing cultural wars or reinforcing social polarization, have not exactly taken root. Now, it doesn't mean they don't exist, as Ashot mentioned, right? Certain opposition forces, or what we call in the literature the authoritarian vestiges, have attempted to introduce populist discourse. And we have seen how certain Russian elements, through their hybrid warfare against Armenia, has attempted to weaponize populism. But none of these have worked. And the three tributes that I addressed, democratic political culture, an organic civic society that combats this, and the overarching transitional process in Armenia has actually curtailed those developments. So, in generally, what we see is that populist leaders tend to have a disfiguring impact on institutions, rule of law, and separation of powers that generally comprise constitutional democracies. While separation of powers in Armenia are structurally problematic because the transitional phase and the reforms haven't gone through, we have not seen any disfiguring impact on institutions or the rule of law by the post-Soviet government. It has actually been the opposite. And so when populist leaders sort of, stretch the bounds of constitutional democracy, right, and try to open the doors to authoritarian solutions to societal problems, these tend to conflate, the process of challenging the establishment and dismantling democratic institutions. We have not seen these in Armenia. And I'll proceed with two very simple examples. It would have been very popular in Armenia if the post-Velvet government, for example, immediately engaged in lustration and fired pretty much everyone in government or in bureaucracy that was part of the previous regime. That would have been quite a populist move. But understanding that this violates international law, that it's going to create problems with the Venice Commission, that it is in essence impermissible and it would stretch the boundaries of constitutionality and separation of powers, Armenia's government refrained from doing that. And so while that was very unpopular with respect to society's expectations, the government chose to engage in a more responsible, law-abiding demeanor. Same with respect to due process. It's very, very common for populist leaders to basically scapegoat, target, and persecute previous establishment leaders or quote-unquote elites, as we've discussed. And this just happens to be in very high demand in Armenia by much of society. Yet the government has refrained from taking such populist actions because these would harm democratic consolidation and institution building. So when we look at sort of these attributes at a more nuanced level, it becomes quite evident that by virtue of these structural factors that I've noted, populism has failed to establish itself as an effective or a influential a component in affecting Armenia's democratization. Some of you have noted, discussed the problem of nationalism with respect to populism, and there's a lot of literature on this. And I use the term weaponization of nationalism when I try to study the relationship between populism, the elite that runs society, and the gap between the political populist elite and the rest of the people. And as that was noted when it was a discussion in Azerbaijan, and we're seeing some of these develop in Georgia, this sort of adoration of the concept of sovereignty, right? Where the concept is utilized as sort of a standalone concept that justifies the behavior of the political leadership and that they could do whatever they want because of the contours of sovereignty. We have not seen this develop in Armenia. In that context, when we see the utilization of sovereignty as a basis of establishing these sort of internal and external enemies, quote unquote, this is very common in the discourse and the policies of popular leaders. Erdogan has done this extensively. Bolsonaro did this in Brazil before he was voted out. Orban has perfected these mechanisms. And of course, Aliyev has become sort of the prime initiator of these kind of discourses and activities. So overarchingly, what we're seeing is that none of these have basically taken root in Armenia. And while in Armenia, we do see some level of political toxicity between the 25-27% minority and the rather large and a very vast majority that support the pro-Western trend, the whole democracy project, this has not resulted to any of the concerns or problems that we see in populist discourse. And so the fusion of nationalism, right, allows for the insertion of identity politics. And identity politics has become a very important tool that populist leaders use, which is fused with nationalism, that they weaponize. The very obvious discourse on othering the given perceived enemies, whether they're external or internal. We have not seen identity politics develop in Armenia. There have been attempts. Ashot noted the recent movements by fringe groups in Armenia. After the Velvet Revolution, very much like what we had in Europe, we saw the attempt of the far right try to establish itself in the political field, but none of these worked. Armenian society simply rejected it. And so in that context, when we look at these developments, few things become very apparent. Armenia's government, the Velvet government, has actually been sort of on the receiving end of populist attacks. And so what we see in Armenia is sort of a inverse development of populist discourse and rhetoric. So it's the government that's been accused of being anti-nationalistic, globalist, or the whole Soros-funded discourse, which is the bread and butter of populism. In that context, it's not Armenia's government that utilizes this discourse, but it's Armenia's government that is subjected to this kind of discourse. More so, we have seen Armenia's government, unlike what we see in Azerbaijan or other countries, a refusal to ethnicize the conflict. And so de-ethnicization suggests a refusal to fall into the traps of nationalism and populism that are used extensively by illiberal leaders. And so collectively, these dynamics allow us to more culturally understand where populism has tried to make minimal inroads, but overarchingly, it has been disrupted in Armenia. And so when we see this whole, attempt by modern populists to promote a direct relationship between the populist leadership and the people, right? This relies on the audience validation of the leader, right? And so these leaders tend to remove intermediary actors, such as parties, institutions, bureaucracies, and try to develop a direct relationship with their followers. We have not seen this happen in Armenia, right? And the biggest guardrail against that is civil society. So Armenia's government never oversteps civil society, has a very functional and respectful relationship with civil society, because civil society is the political base of the current government, considering most came from it. So when we look at various populist leaders, from Erdogan to Bolsonaro to Duarte, who was in Philippines, right, to Orban, so on and so forth, even Berlusconi at one point in Italy, all populist leaders either came from the elite, from the wealthy elite, or they came from the political system itself. Armenia's situation is unique because Armenia's current leadership, right, after the 18 and 21 elections, neither of the government elite or the current prime minister was from the wealthy elite, nor was he ever part of any government institution previously. So this unique exogenous factor has kind of insulated Armenia's post-Velvet government from falling into the trappings of populism. And so to quickly start kind of wrapping up my conversation here, another important component that I do want to address with respect to this is the electorate, right? Because depending on a country, populist leaders rely on exploiting societal and electoral cleavages to be successful in elections. We see, for example, the center-periphery cleavage in developed democracies. We saw this in the UK during Brexit. We saw this in the United States in the last two elections. We saw some of this in France, right, between sort of the success of the far right in the countryside, while the Parisian and sort of the urban areas tended to prefer the more non-illiberal and democratic parties. And so Turkey, for example, has done a really good job of sort of, tapping into the city countryside cleavage, right? Erdogan consistently pits the conservative countryside against the quote-unquote city elite. In the Philippines, right, when Duarte was president, he did this extensively, right? He relied on the poor in the countryside to advance his illiberal policies. We have not really seen this in Armenia. When we look at the electoral field, there are some minor marginal cleavages between the countryside and the city core. Armenia's Velvet government electorally, when we look at the statistical data, they perform quite well across all sectors. The only sector they don't perform well with, if we look at the data and we disaggregate it, is with the wealthy core in Yerevan. That's very interesting because it is that wealthy core that tends to be the populist base. So this is why I know there's an inverse relationship in Armenia when we observe the development of these populist conditions. And so overall, the literature shows that populist leaders use three basically main tools, right? One is anti-establishment rhetoric, okay? They criticize the political system, but they never criticize the economic system because that is their bread and butter. The post-Velvet political leadership has done neither. They have criticized the previous regime, which the Armenian people overthrew, but there has not been sort of these critiques of blame this institution, or blame the deep state, or a lot of this discourse that we see in populist rhetoric. Also, an important tool that populist leaders use is attack on political correctness in whatever iteration, right? In Armenia, it's actually the opposite. The Armenian government is consistently criticized for being sensitive to political correctness. And so when we look at sort of the contours of these developments, right, it brings us to the third tool, which is elections. There was a lot of discussion that we saw on Georgia. Azerbaijan really doesn't have elections. In Armenia, because of the guardrails of civil society and its democratic culture, the government's conceptualization of elections is very different. Elections are about repudiating the previous regime and preserving democracy. In that discourse, tapping into populist rhetoric becomes contradictory. Therefore, Armenia's political system disincentivizes any attempts at reviving or utilizing populism at the state level. And so to kind of wrap up in my conclusion, right, we see that the contours of the very concept of populism and its intrinsic illiberal characteristics have remained minimal and primarily have failed to take root in post-Velvet Revolution Armenia. When we look at Armenia's democratic breakthrough and its burgeoning democratic political culture, these have served as important guardrails against the development of populism in the country's political system. More so, this has been buttressed and strengthened by the country's severe security environment, because Armenia right now not only faces direct threats from neighboring Azerbaijan, who occupies Armenian territories, but also, as was noted, the continuous hybrid warfare from Russia. In this context, Armenia's government's commitment to democracy qualified as a very important instrument within its nascent security architecture. So when Armenia's government looks at these developments and views democracy as a mechanism of security, this does not and will not allow the government to alter its method of governing and thus engage in populist discourse. More so, the government has actually engaged in quote-unquote unpopular decision-making, such as making concessions or seeking peace, that a populist political leadership would not have done that. But these are pragmatic decisions as opposed to what we see in populist demeanor. So overarchingly, Armenia's success in avoiding the trappings of populism has strongly enhanced three very important variables: its civic society, as I noted, its democratic cultural syndromes, and the fact that the illiberal opposition has failed to reverse Armenia's democratic gains. I think I'll stop at this. We might be running out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Nerses. Thank you, Dr. Kopalyan. I have an immediate remark. Actually, you know, Armenia appears to be the least populist country of the sub-region, and it happens that Armenia is the least authoritarian country of the region. I mean, I don't want to take, you know, and invent a universal causality out of that, but that's the case, you know, isn't it?
There's a very high correlation. The causality variables may very likely be there, but indeed, and that's because, I mean, as we've noted, you know, populism tends to be intrinsically illiberal and is based on precepts of backsliding. And so whenever you have democratic or transitional democracy seeking to consolidate, populism obstructs that. In Armenia's case, as I noted, its characteristics are very, very different. And that's primarily due to the fact that whereas in Georgia, it was either Saakashvili or Georgia Dream at one point, in Armenia, it was basically the Velvet government or the previous authoritarians. So the fear of an authoritarian return is what is to a large extent curbing populist rise in Armenia. Whereas in Georgia, there is no fear of a previous Shevardnadze iteration coming back. And that has changed the dynamics. And of course, in Azerbaijan, it's meaningless to talk about any of these components because authoritarian regimes, even their hegemonic iteration, as Jody noted, do not really care about these components because the electoral process has no substantive relevance.
Thank you, Nerses. The floor is yours, ladies, gentlemen. Lamia Hanım, Adilgizi, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Lamia, a journalist from Azerbaijan. Thank you for organizing this panel discussion. I have questions to Jody and Ashot and Nerses, which speech was quite very interesting. First of all, I wanted to ask Nerses that like before the war happened in Karabakh, the entire Azerbaijan, especially the media representatives and civil society representatives, we were following the rhetoric of Pashinyan, not only Pashinyan, but the government behavior and the discourse that was going around it. And yeah, my question would be, could you please elaborate on why Pashinyan, particularly before 44 days war, chose to sort of employ populist rhetoric or behaviors in his approach to interaction with Aliyev, considering that the authoritarian nature of his leadership? Do you think that that really served or was serving Armenian interests, given the fact that the territories, I mean, all of those lands were on the Armenian side? And how all this entire situation right now can impact the peace negotiations, I'm saying in brackets, that are going on in between two countries. And my next question will be to Ashot, if possible. Could you please let us understand, because sometimes really the situation around what's going media in both Armenia and Azerbaijan, we journalists, we are sort of, hindered from the political development that are going in Armenia. And you touched the very important points of peacekeeping and peace building processes in Armenia. Like, let's be honest, the peace negotiations or the whole structure around what's going on right now in Karabakh, in terms of Azerbaijani side, it's total unclear. Neither civil society representative, no journalists have any clue idea what's going on right now. Given the fact that the president is going out publicly criticizing the attractive diplomacy initiatives, the people who are coming together in Georgia as a neutral zone to sort of unfrozen those sentiments. But I mean, my question is, like, given all these populist sentiments, nationalistic sentiments, is there any hope to really build peace between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, not only on the government level, but also, between two societies? Thank you.
Thank you, Lamia. Bülent, if you have given up your question, I will give the floor to Nerses.
Yes, maybe my question is much simpler than Lamia's. I wonder about the situation in Armenia and Azerbaijan. I know and we know that Armenia has better relations with Russia and Iran, and Iranian regime and Russian regime is well now. They are a kind of theocracy and autocracy. And Azerbaijan regime is closer to European countries and also has good relations with Israel. But we know that the regime's characters is vice versa. The Armenian regime is much opener than Azerbaijan regime, but Azerbaijan regime is much resemble to Russian or in terms of ideological, not the theocratically, the Iranian regime. How could you explain this contradiction? My question is to Jody.
Jody. Okay, Nerses, you have the floor.
Thank you. So a few points to make here. The developments that led to the 2020 war cannot be reduced to one statement or post-Velvet developments. These were structural factors that we had since 1994 that led to both sides assuming a very maximalist posture. So the 2020 war was in essence inevitable. If we look at Azerbaijan's capabilities and the level of spending that it was doing militarily, the power disparity made it conducive to initiate conflict. So in that context, if Aliyev did not get what he wanted, he was going to utilize warfare. It was an open policy that he had. So the post-Velvet rhetoric that we were seeing coming out of Armenia was not populist. It was a continuation of existing policies. And to say that a statement or two can qualify an entire shift in regional structural factors is just not consistent with how things work. So Armenia's government, in essence, after the Velvet, took the position that negotiations have to be more inclusive, and they attempted to integrate the Armenian population in Nagorno-Karabakh. Whether this was appealing or made sense to Aliyev or not is a different point, but that is not a populist posture. More so, for domestic political reasons, you have two societies that for 3 decades have built their identities based on this conflict. To simply suggest that discussing those contours constitutes populism is not exactly what we're engaging with here. So I do not the demeanor of the Velvet government after the revolution had anything to do in triggering the war. The contours of the war were basically going on for some time. When the 2016 flare-up happened of 4 days of intense fighting, there was no Velvet Revolution, there was no democracy, and so trying to draw analogies with that is just, it's spurious. It doesn't work when we talk about it empirically. Now, when we look at the current situation, as the question asked, your question to Ashot is at the societal level, so I'll let him address that. When we study these sort of notions of peace, right, there are two main contours in the literature, liberal peace and illiberal peace. Azerbaijan and Russia engage in illiberal peace, so what we call authoritarian conflict management. And these type of regimes need consistent, basically, conflict, right? Conflict persistence. This is very, very well established in the literature. And so when a regime whose entire identity and political system is designed to function in such a way, especially when it's a petro-autocracy, it's hard to imagine those kind of regimes seeking or agreeing to peace. And from the lens of pure rational choice theory, I don't think it's in Aliyev's strategic interest to sign peace, because he has such a power of disparity at this point that he maximizes resources to maintain and basically control developments. So I don't think anything is going to be signed anytime soon unless there's sufficient Western pressure. And Azerbaijan, and Tom the Waal talked about this initially, Azerbaijan has been able to navigate in a way where it's a regime is able to absorb and mitigate that pressure. Now, how sustainable that is a different question. But if we're talking about the interests of two governments, authoritarian regimes do not prefer peace, especially when they're in a position of power. This simply contradicts all the scholarship out there. And so if we're going to understand this, there's 2 points. Either a power parity is reached between two sides, in which case Aliyev will be incentivized to sign peace, or there must be very robust external Western pressure. If these two things don't happen, you're not going to see peace anytime in the region, or at least anything that's signed.
Ashot?
Thank you very much once again. These questions also, it's possible, thanks to the European Center for Populist Studies, and this such kind of platform, I would say, this between Armenian and Azerbaijan and other these activities. So nowadays, so peace agenda, I would say peace agreement, and also this Pashinyan's initiative regarding peace crossroads, also be part of, for example, this middle corridor between EU and Central Asian countries. So it's all shown that so Armenia has a real strategic and interest to develop, and also the Prime Minister and government speaking about it and doing and making, I would say also success in that direction according to our governmental activity. So, but the region is difficult. So after the post-war situation is difficult. So I mentioned about Yuan Gaitung, this nice book called Peace by Peaceful Means, but peace it is impossible by war or wartime means, I would say. In that case, I think, if you're trying to understand the situation, I think it's government try to fight or to solve the situation, what I would say this managed enmity or managed hostility between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So by the Armenian side, it's important to have so this normalized situation indeed in our region, and it's important that Armenia try to be part of this even after the war, after the difficult situations what happens in our region, to be part of this regional activity. I think it's very important to see that in the context of also European integration, this democratization, and also about our regime. I would say that according lot of indexes, if we are comparing the development about democratization, I would say, so according Freedom House indexes, we have a hybrid and transitional government. So it means that it's look like semi-consolidated democratarian regime. We are trying so achieving in that level of our democratization institutions. But I think in that case also we and other countries in the region, we have to do a lot in that direction. So,
thank you, Ashot. Jody?
Yes, in the interest of time, I'll keep this short and say I think you're pointing out something that all of us who work on the region take for granted, which is that both the states outside of the region as well as those inside of the region are pursuing a number of different strategic and foreign policy objectives at the same time. So I think it's good evidence that ideology or sort of regime type affinity we can't necessarily determine some of the international alliances that we might see, given the complexity of foreign policy objectives involved on all sides, really. And Azerbaijan has been incredibly successful at balancing its major powers around it and pursuing its interests on the foreign scene, while also keeping a lot of different partners and actors in play in different ways over the years. That said, I think my take on the literature, I would say, is that it's hard to generalize. I'm less comfortable generalizing in exactly what authoritarian regimes, to agree that they all prefer war. But what we can say, I think, is that there is rational calculations going on all sides. So I don't think that ideology gets us all the way to understanding the foreign policies that we observe.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all. I don't see any hands anymore. Ladies, gentlemen, we are on time. Thank you very much. Bülent, you want to have the last word?
Actually, Anastasia will close.
Okay, let's Anastasia close.
Yes, so dear distinguished panelists, thank you very much for these very insightful presentations, and Professor Aktar for your great moderation and assessments. And dear attendees, your questions and remarks greatly enriched the panel discussion. So please mark your calendars for our upcoming panels on November 14th and November 28th, 2024. And be sure to register and join us as we explore what do the US presidential election results tell us about the future trajectory of populism and the rise and reign of autocratic populism and Islamist nationalism in Turkey. I wish you all a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys.